Hello, my name is Miss Amber, and I'm here with the English 12B live lesson for today. Now, the last couple videos have just been about getting started, how to read through the slides and take notes, and other things. So what I'm going to do today is just straight up dive right in to the first lesson of English 12B. So I'm just going to share my screen here. Here we go. We're just going to dive right in. The lesson is about the introduction to Romanticism. So I'm going to scroll over to slide 5 and get started. So basically, this slide just explains that the Romantic period, they give you the dates 1785 to 1830. You should put that in your notes, is a period of time that's driven by social, historical, and philosophical change. So social change means change of how people interact with each other. Historical is changing in terms of history, the actual events that are happening. And philosophical changes, which is changes in how people are thinking. So three of its most important influences were the Industrial Revolution, the French Revolution, and the perceived, that means what people think, shortcomings of Enlightenment thinking. So they start off by explaining the Industrial Revolution and how it's related. So basically, the Industrial Revolution was when factories started becoming a thing. And on the one hand, people were able to make lots more things than they were able to make before. They were able to streamline production into lines in factories to make things more efficient. Instead of people making things one by hand, you would have a row of people doing the same job on the same thing as they move throughout the factory. So you could produce a lot more. That meant there were a lot more jobs for people, and they could make more money to take care of themselves. Now, the downside of all this was that the conditions for working were really bad. People were crowded into cities so that they could be close to the factory that they were working in, which was a problem. When you have people cramped in a place like that, lots of disease, filth, and overcrowding, they highlight that here. Disease, filth, and overcrowding was stuff that city dwellers had to deal with on a daily basis. So people were getting sick. There was the cholera pandemic. And I think cholera, for example, erupted on 3 separate occasions in London, lasting 31 years. So smokestacks and chimneys became symbols of city life. So people started thinking about, like, let's go back to simple life when people used to live on the land and just sort of take things slowly. They were just tired of being sick and being, like abused and um, being taken advantage of and living in poor conditions just to make money. So that's part of how the Romantic movement started. The second influence was ideals of the French Revolution. So the idea of equality between the nobility and people was something that people wanted in Britain. So they were inspired by that and by the emphasis on the common person. So in the French Revolution, basically, the common people rose up and was like, there's a lot more than us than there are you, and we're, paying taxes and stuff. We deserve representation. We deserve to be treated equally, that kind of thing. So a lot of that also inspired the Romantic movement. And there was a lot of emphasis on individual people and the lives that they lived in the Romantic period. So instead of just viewing a country as just the nobles and the commoners, there was a lot of emphasis on, well, here's what a day in the life is like for your average person, or here's what this one person enjoys, instead of focusing on like epic stories or focusing on how people can work together to accomplish a goal. They were like, no, we want individual stories about just people's thoughts while they are relaxing and doing things that aren't just getting sick or working to death. And then lastly, it was a backlash against the Enlightenment philosophy. So Enlightenment thinkers thought that order and structure would create a peaceful world. So basically, follow all the rules. It doesn't matter if you understand them, just obey. And if you can follow the rules of life, either by religion or by the efficiency of being able to work and follow the rules of the ideas that people were putting forth at the time, that you'll be happy. And the Romantics were like, no, that doesn't make us happy, really. So they wrote about things that did. Enlightenment thinkers were very much about science, making people follow rules and orders. And romantics were like, it's not great to just follow rules without any kind of, you know, thought to what exists outside of stuff. So it just seems like you're just forcing people to do what you want and saying that the rules are what they are to get people to do that. So we're going to focus on what makes people individuals, their emotional and creative states. And that's what a lot of people wrote about during the Romantic period. So we get to here, this slide number 8, and it gives you characteristics of Romanticism. So they're basically giving you a list telling you what you can find in Romantic writing. So this list is here because when people hear romantic, they think of like love and relationships. But this is romantic as in imagery and daydreaming. So that's where the word originally came from. When you romanticize something, you're thinking about it in a way that elevates it or makes it ideal. You want to see this thing as good so much that you daydream about how good it is and don't think about any of the parts that make things bad or intolerable. So romanticism is basically writers at the time ignoring the terrible things that were happening in terms of the factories and stuff like that, and choosing to write instead about what they thought was better, which was personal thoughts, the countryside, not having to worry about strife or disease or anything. So this list here, there's emphasis on originality, individuality, and creativity. There's experimentation with form or content, emphasis on feelings, thoughts, intuition, and imagination, emphasis on mysticism and the supernatural with nature as a tool for introspection. So they're using nature in the countryside to sort of create a magical feeling that you can't get from working in the factories and things like that. Belief in the natural goodness of people. So basically just believing that the Industrial Revolution and the conditions that people were forced to live and work in were what made them bad, and that returning to natural roots would make things better. And then the highest aspirations are positive in nature rather than self-serving. So really they just idealized or romanticized nature. And elements of nationalism, so adoration of one's country or culture. So a lot of their writing was, wow, these cities don't represent who we are. Let's go back to the natural land, the way that things used to be. Our country provides for us. It's clearly better than being in the cities, that kind of thing. So then we start talking about romantic literature. Remember, literature is writing. So these are descriptions of different writings that came out during the Romantic period and what they were like. So two of the most inventive writers during this period were Thomas Gray and William Blake, and they were poets. Even though so basically their poetry blended characteristics of neoclassicism and romanticism. So they considered themselves neoclassical authors. So they used a lot of the old rules for writing in terms of how to put poetry together. So if you don't remember from any of the other grades, there's a lot of rules about how to write poetry, a lot of rules for how many syllables can be in a line, which lines have to rhyme. Different types of poems had different names. And if you were writing that type of poem, what you would have to do is follow the rules and try to make it pretty while you were following the rules for writing. So they mixed that stuff together with romantic themes to sort of have the best of what they thought were both worlds. So we get lots of magical descriptions of nature and being able to love your country and what it provides naturally outside of the cities. But they use the rules that came from older forms of writing to blend them together. There are other writers, though, William Wordsmith and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who considered themselves romantics. They didn't really use any of the stuff, the rules from neoclassical times. And when they did, they tried to change it or break through with some new ideas, put a new spin on it. So they considered themselves romantics. It says they outright rejected the ideals of the Enlightenment as well as the style and structure of neoclassical literature. And then they also say that scholars consider 1798, the year that Wordsworth and Coleridge published a poetry collection, to be the founding of Romanticism. So basically, people were kind of just writing to do their best. But once this book came out called Lyrical Ballads, this was like the start of Romanticism. It had a form. People could look at this and say, okay, this is what we want our literature and our poetry to look like and read like now. So yeah, by combining lyrics and ballads, the authors created a new interpretations of these genres mixed with stuff from the Romantic period. So we have vocabulary of Romantic poetry. So they're just telling you about the different types of words that gets used. So Romantic poets moved away from the highbrow language of early writers, preferring to use the real language of men. So basically what they're saying is that instead of using big fancy words, part of Romanticism is just putting things simply. People who live out in the countryside are not people who are nobles. They're not royalty. They're not super highly educated. So they wanted their poems to be able to be read by the everyday person who was working in factories to give them a little relief. So the example they give you is Wordsworth's Daffodils. That's the name of the poem. And it says, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, besides the lake beneath the trees fluttering and dancing in the breeze. So they're just describing a group of daffodils as a crowd. And the daffodils are by a lake under a tree and they're fluttering. That's it. It's just a description, a beautiful description of flowers underneath a tree and beside a lake. And the image of this, being able to put it into words like this, is supposed to just sort of like remind people of better times. And they didn't use fancy language to do this. The fanciest word in this poem is probably fluttering, maybe. But even you as a student knows what fluttering is, you know? So part of Romantic poetry was being able to be easily understood by anyone who read it. And this style gave poets a lot more freedom to use poetic devices. So people didn't have to rhyme, but they could. They didn't have to have a certain number of syllables in their lines the way that the older styles did. So poets had a lot more freedom to sort of do whatever they wanted, but still give you this sort of soft memory of nature that's supposed to give you powerful feelings. So then we talk about transitional poets. So transitional poets are basically poets that were between those different ages. So Thomas Gray is just one of them, and they give you an excerpt from a poem he wrote called Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard. And it's definitely romantic in terms of how he wrote it because of the imagery that's in it, the picture that he paints. So I'm not going to go through and read the excerpt for you, but just take time to try to recall what I've said before about the different elements of Romantic poetry, and just look for those while you're reading the poem. They give you a little bit of an explanation here. It combines Romantic and neoclassical elements. And they told you that Thomas Gray was a transitional poet. So that means between periods. So he, kind of like Coleridge, viewed it like had writings that were in between. So some of it was influenced by the old neoclassical stuff, but some of it was also inspired by the stuff that people do for Romanticism. So it says written in by iambic pentameter. So that's a pattern from older forms of writing. Iambic means that there is a pattern in the syllables where one thing is unstressed and then stressed. So this is like how words sound. He's specifically picking words that sound a certain way when you say them. And the pentameter means that the pattern of an unstressed and then stressed syllable repeats 5 times. So that tells you that the lines are going to have 10 syllables. And then it says it follows a traditional structure with typical ABAB rhyme scheme. So every other line rhymes. And it says, although the structure of the poem is typical of neoclassical literature because he's following those rules, the content is more romantic because it focuses on the emotions of the speaker. So remember in the list of elements of romantic poetry, focus on people's thoughts, focus on nature. It describes the scenery of where the person is having these thoughts. So it's definitely influenced by Romanticism. So we have a section here on William Blake. William Blake was not a successful poet during his lifetime. And even though he wrote a lot, his contributions, what he wrote basically, wasn't recognized until the Romantic period was in full swing. So he was a little earlier than everyone on the train. And because it wasn't popular at the time, he didn't really get any recognition. So now his stuff is a little more famous now that we know to group his stuff in with the Romantic period. But when he was alive, people weren't having it. So basically, a lot of his poems are romantic. It says here, for example, his poems emphasize the importance of imagination and creativity and include supernatural elements. His vision, however, was broader than neoclassicism and romanticism. He was concerned with ideas and themes that fell outside of the scope of mainstream thought. So basically, he said, I see what you're doing with the romanticism. I also see what you're doing combining it with the old rules to get something, but I'm trying to think outside of the box. So his poetry was kind of pushing it at the time, and that's why he wasn't super popular. So we get a couple poems from him, The Lamb and the Tiger. You've probably seen the tiger poem before, Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright. That's like a very famous quote. You may have heard it somewhere. But they're just giving you an example of his poems at the time. Again, I'm not going to read the excerpts, but they give you a description of what his poems are like and how he kind of thinks outside of the box, not just focusing on nature of the countryside in Britain. He focuses on other things too. So we go through The Lamb, which is one of his most famous poems. And this slide gives you a description of the lamb and what it represents. It's about an innocent lamb and the God that made it. And they just give you the description here in this slide for this poem. So I'm not going to go through all of this. This is slide 19, and they pretty much break it down for you very well. This is more explanation of like the themes and how it was influenced by Christianity, because the lamb is often referenced in the Bible as being, like an innocent sort of animal that represents devout followers of God and sometimes Jesus. So let's see, outside of that, we get to the tiger, which is a different type of poem, even though it's themed a little similarly. So they're both focused on creation, what is made, how the world is made. And it has themes of nature in it because both of these animals were made and are parts of nature to a certain degree. But part of the difference is the lamb is an animal that you can find on farms. It's a lot more of a traditional romantic sort of thing because farm animals were how people got meat. Running farms were how people got vegetables at the time. Taking care of livestock was a part of that. So it's a little more relatable. You're not going to see a tiger in Europe. You're not going to see a tiger on the countryside. So this poem has a similar theme, but it's more of Blake's outside of the box kind of work. And that's why they include both of them, because they're similar, but also different in a way that shows you the difference between Blake's romantic writings and some of the like pushing the envelope stuff that made him not popular. So let's see. Moving on, I think this is the last section I'm going to be able to get through today for this lesson. But the founders of Romanticism, so they're giving you more information about some of the authors that they mentioned earlier in this lesson. So they start off with William Wordsworth, and they give you information about his life that influenced what he wrote. They tell you where he grew up. They tell you about things that influenced him. Wordsworth lost his mother. They also tell you about what his role in Romanticism was. He was part of the first generation of authors that was like, we're done with the neoclassicism. We're moving on to this new thing. And he's one of the authors that helped found Romanticism as he broke away from that. We get a poem from him, Tintern Abbey. And this is just another example of romantic writing. So while you're reading through this, keep in mind everything that's been said before about the emphasis on personal thoughts, the little mysticism, nature being elevated like on a pedestal. All these things you should be able to see in his poem. There's a lot more poems in this lesson because a lot of them are short, or the excerpts of them are short. Let's see. This is another poem by Wordsworth, My Heart Leaps Up. Also remember that Romanticism involves simple language. So these shouldn't be poems that are too hard to read. There might be a couple words that you don't understand. So like, for example, on this page, you might have to look up piety. You might have to look it up. You could just put it in the dictionary, plop it right here and get the definition. But overall, it should be pretty easy for you to read through some of these. These poems are short. They have simple language because Romanticism was a movement that was made so that people could understand the poems and didn't have to be very highly educated or have to study a language for a certain number of years to understand it. Let's see. So then we get to Samuel Taylor Coleridge. So he and Wordsworth were friends. So this is just another author who was part of the generation of people that founded Romanticism. So you get a lot of information about him, his career, what his personal life was like, demonstrating originality, both of them breaking apart from neoclassicism and the rules from before. A lot of the information here is similar in terms of the approach to poetry as Wordsworth, but you just get personal information about his life and how that influenced his writing. And we get other excerpts from things that he did too. Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner is a very famous poem that Coleridge wrote. And it has a lot of supernatural magical elements to it that's a part of Romanticism. And they pretty much break it down, like I said, well for there. They give you these excerpts. You're able to see what it is that he's doing in the poem with the descriptions that they give you here. Let's see. And Kubla Khan, I think, is the last thing that we get in this section from him. It's his only unfinished work. He wasn't able to complete it. And it's about a Chinese emperor from the 13th century. So that would be the 1200s that built a castle that was later destroyed. But he wasn't able to finish the poem. Let's see. I think this is the actual last thing before. Yep. So they give you the analysis for Kubla Khan. The important thing for this lesson to remember, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. The important thing for this lesson to remember are the different elements that make up Romanticism. All these examples are just so that you can see over and over the different parts of the Romantic era. Please do read through those poems and try to understand what the lesson is telling you about what those things mean. But it should be easier for you to understand the interpretation of those poems when you understand and remember what Romanticism was about. It was about breaking away from the crowded, terrible conditions of the Industrial Revolution. It was about there being more focus on the creativity of individual people instead of just groups of people being lumped together and being forced to work together towards a common goal that may not have been their own. And it was also about being able to use simple language to still help people see the beauty in nature, and to get back to the roots of what life was like before the Industrial Revolution. So those are the important themes to remember. And I think that as long as you have those down pat while you're going through and reading those poems, you won't have too hard a time. Of course, if you do have any issues with those poems, please feel free to reach out for a tutoring session. You can have a tutor go over those poems with you, and just make sure that you are taking notes about the information they give you on those poems and why they are important. Alrighty, that's it for me for today. So this is Miss Amber signing off, and good luck with your English course.